Michelle.
Hi.
All right, so while you're setting up, I'm going to go ahead and give you a little introduction to folks. So welcome everyone. Again, thank you for joining. Thank you for your patience. And as I mentioned at the top, Nathaniel Brislin will not be joining us due to unforeseen circumstances. So Michelle Souliere has agreed to shoulder all of the burden of talking about Bigfoot tonight. So thank you, Michelle. And Michelle has just written her second book. It's Bigfoot in Maine. And Michelle is a graduate of the Maine College of Art. She's been around Portland for a long time. She owns Green Hand Bookshop in Portland on Congress Street. If you haven't given her store a visit, please do. It's phenomenal. And it's where you can get a copy of her book for yourself if you'd like. And I'm sure that Michelle can tell us a little bit about that. Gonna try and just do some quick. There we go. All right. Hey, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us.
It's wonderful to be here.
So I'm sure you heard my little spiel about how you are awesome and your bookstore is awesome and your books are awesome. I was talking a little bit before you got here about how this is your second work and that you had written Strange Maine prior to this. Mm-hmm. Is there anything I missed? Would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
No, I think you did a great job of covering all the basics. we know each other, and you've introduced me before at other talks, so.
Well, excellent. Then I think we can dive right into the questions. Mm-hmm. So this will be a little bit of an interview format for everyone joining us. So I've got questions and Michelle will answer. And then at the end of the program, we'll do about 15 or 20 minutes of attendee question and answers. So Michelle, if we could just start with the basics. This creature we're going to discuss tonight, what's the right terminology? Is it Bigfoot? Is it Sasquatch? Are there regional differences?
There are definitely regional differences between like North and South, East and West. I think on the West Coast, Sasquatch is more commonly applied. But in Maine, people seem pretty comfortable just calling it Bigfoot or them Bigfoot. So that's a good thing to stick with, I think, for us. But, down south, they have stuff like they call them, some of them call them boogers or, there's other funny variations, sometimes very local and sometimes more widely regional. So it'd be interesting to sit down and like do a list sometime of all the different variations.
Of all those different names. Yeah, thank you. So, we've mentioned this a little bit in the introductions, but yours is one of two Bigfoot projects dropping this summer. There's your book, there's Nathaniel's film. Why Bigfoot in Maine and why now?
Oh, well, I mean, mostly the answer is that I'm finally done the book. I've been working on this since I finished Strange Maine, so over a decade. And I actually finished it last year in the midst of COVID. Somehow I managed to get everything tied together and wrapped up, did all the illustrations and processed all the photos for reproduction and all of that fun stuff. So it's really been a long project, and I'm not done. I'm in it for the long haul. I'm 99% sure I'll be doing a volume 2. Yeah. I've already started collecting other accounts to compile, and this one should be a lot quicker because I know what I'm doing now so far as the format goes, and I'm comfortable with that. But one of the great things about it taking so long was that some people that I had tried contacting in the past took, 2 or 3 years to finally get around to contacting me back. So that actually worked out really well. And in the meantime, I wound up with other accounts in nearby areas and in close chronological proximity to some of the existing accounts I was working on. So by the end of tying it all together, it came together really well. It was like everything kind of lined up, and it's interesting. I'm seeing the same kind of thing with the accounts I'm putting together for the next book, where I have, 3 or 4 accounts all in a very close area, in another remote region of Maine. So I'm curious to see how the next one pans out in that respect.
Yeah, so I'm very curious, and I think our attendees will be also, what is a research project, a process like for a project like this? And what was your research process like? It sounds like it was quite a lengthy process.
Mm-hmm. It was. It started out in my normal, milieu, which is all historic archive diving, pulling stuff out of old texts, out of old newspapers, out of newspapers that are thankfully digitized and searchable now. And so it was a lot of that. And then Daniel Green's book came out, Shadows in the Wood, which is all about Maine Bigfoot, but his was all drawn from archives, mostly online archives as well. And so articles that I had been hoping to give people as source material that hadn't been in print for, over a century, suddenly it was already out there. And so I was like, oh, what am I going to do? And I was like, oh, wait, he didn't actually talk to anybody. I just need to start talking to people, which is, sounds really easy when you say it like that, but that's quite the process too. So I had to kind of readjust what I was doing. I had done a few in-person or over the phone interviews for other stories I'd done for Strange Maine in the past, but nothing as concentrated as this, and nothing as kind of touchy as this, because for some people it was a life-changing, pretty much everybody I talked to, it was a life-changing incident, or series of events. And while people might be willing at one point in time to talk about it, 5 minutes later they might not want to talk about it. So it was a lot of trying to settle into a groove where I could make people feel comfortable talking to me, allow them to talk rather than pepper them with questions right up front. And then try to make sure I filled in the blanks after they had their say, and then ask the questions that I needed to ask, the little details that might not have been in the initial dialogue with them. So, and then, and then I had to sit down and transcribe all of that. Because when I interview people, I record them because I might be taking notes. Well, I'm always taking notes, but I don't want to misquote anybody. I want everybody's own words to be accurate and correct. I don't want to have to make assumptions about what they said. And so I transcribe the entire interview. And then when I write, I kind of weave their words in with the questions that I ask them later. And so that all the details, so the first thing you get is their version of it, like as they would tell it as a narrative. And then after that, I go more into the details that people are going to be wondering about, like, what was the terrain like? Was there anybody else around? Are there any nearby population centers that might affect their movement through that area? And all those little nitty-gritty things. So I guess it's understandable that it took a long time to write, because it's, even just doing interviews is an astonishingly involved process.
Of course, because you have to give people space to let their story out while still getting the information that you need. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, how do you know what questions to ask? I was really struck when you just said, asking about what the terrain was like. Were the questions that you brought to those interviews based on the research you had done?
I have, I drew up a little worksheet, because when you're talking to somebody and you're in the moment, you oftentimes forget things. So I always have like a little checklist that once we've moved through the larger part of the account, I can kind of try to ask these questions as the conversation leads to them. And I think that's a little bit different than anybody else's. We all have our own focus. Like I participate in the Maine Bigfoot Foundation, which is, they have a great little group on Facebook, and they've just launched their own website. But we've talked about what they wanted to do for their worksheet. And one of the leaders of the group came up with questions that I certainly hadn't put on my list, you know. So the questions I'm asking are the ones that I myself would find myself asking as I'm reading through like an online account or something like that. I'm like, what was the region like around it? What was the weather doing? What was the light of day doing? Was there a chance that there's anybody else around you? I try to, like, oftentimes when I'm on the phone with somebody, I will actually be sitting there on my computer and pulling up the location on Google Maps, because looking at the satellite view of the terrain is a really wonderful resource that's, free for the time being, at least. And so you can see, like, if this has happened in this particular place and you can nail it down, you can look and see oftentimes that there's a big belt of greenway that happens to run through that area, where the local water sources are. You can see all that in an aerial view from the Google Maps satellite imagery. And it's extremely helpful when you're trying to figure out adjacency and why something would be moving through that area as opposed to, a mile over. There's sometimes natural barriers, sometimes man-made barriers that affect, the flow of wildlife traffic. So it's, yeah.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I think for those of us who are not necessarily super knowledgeable, those questions never would have crossed my mind. So it's fascinating to hear all of the work that went into crafting the interviews, and it's understandable why the timeline, was extended, and especially when you're relying on other folks to, participate. That makes it, like you said, even more complicated. Now, did the process for this book differ a lot from the process that you used in Strange Maine?
Yeah, it definitely did. Strange Maine has much more varied subject material. Definitely a lot more of the material came from archival sources. Actually, no, they're probably pretty even on that. And honestly, both of them, I took field trips to locations, so that stayed the same. I would say the biggest piece that's drastically different is the intensive amount of interviews, because there are 20 eyewitnesses in the book, and then there's several more people that I talked to who are either connected to those cases or who wound up not being in the book that I had to interview. And, an average interview, I think the shortest ones I did were half an hour, and some of them went to almost 2 hours. So yeah, so that I think would be the biggest difference between the two books, besides like the wideness of focus of Strange Maine, which is kind of like I feel like it's a Whitman sampler box of Maine weirdness.
Yes.
Yeah, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, little different categories. And then the Bigfoot in Maine, which is all focused on everything kind of in this stream of activity that's run through the state's history for a really long time.
I love that. And also it is fascinating that there are these archival materials that show accounts of sightings throughout Maine's history. I think that's really fascinating. Mm-hmm. To shift gears a little bit, I'm curious, I'll hear a lot about the Pacific Northwest in terms of Bigfoot sightings. I know that they have just much different types of forests than we do, but I'm curious, Maine is, I believe, the most forested state by percentage. Does that give Maine a special significance for Bigfoot researchers? Do you think that it is due to our environment that there are so many sightings?
I think that it's due to our environment that we potentially have a much more stable population and more widespread population. in the state. I know in the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of that sort of almost rainforest type environment up there, which is great. But I think they're also pinched a lot more by the logging industry. There's a constant fight between the logging interests and the preservation or conservation interests. In fact, I talked to Peter Byrne, who's been investigating out there for decades and decades, and he was expressing concern that they were getting less and less sightings reported to them. And he worried, and I know that's been a worry of him and some other people, is that the logging is really taking huge chunks out of the wilderness there. So I think Maine, while we have a lot of logging going on, a lot of it that has shifted over to selective logging, which you can see in the overhead views on Google Earth. It looks like all these little almost looks like water systems, like tributaries coming off of you. So you'll have a main logging road coming in, and then you'll see lots of little cleared areas interspersed with trees. It's a really, once you know what you're looking for, you can see it immediately in a lot of locations. So there is, I mean, Maine definitely has plenty of logging activity, but it seems to be slightly less invasive and less final. Like when we clear an area here, it tends to grow back up. And I'm not sure what goes on in the West Coast. That's probably a slightly different culture there for use of the areas, but because they have such a higher population density there in general, I think. But Maine, nobody's going to try to develop land that's, over 100 miles from the nearest population center. It's just not practicable. So I think we luck out because of that, so that there's, between that and the water sources that are just ribboned right through the state, I feel we have a very, we have a wilderness that is amenable to a lot of animals continuing to live in it.
Okay, that makes perfect sense, because yes, having driven through even, like southern parts of the northern corridors of our state, you know, it's a long way off 95. So, you can go, there's so much remote wilderness in our state, that makes perfect sense. I don't know if you have this number off the top of your head, but do you have an estimate of how many sightings there are in a given year in Maine?
I would not be able to hazard a guess, because I think there's still a lot of people who don't report them. And so that, a lot of the people I've talked to, they're reporting cases from the 70s, from the 80s, from the 90s. I felt lucky enough to have some current stuff from the last 10 or 15 years. But yeah, I think there's a lot that doesn't get reported, either because people aren't sure what they saw, or they just brush it off, or they don't want to be made fun of, because that's still,
Of course.
Yeah.
And I almost wonder, if I were to see something on a camping trip in northern Maine, I don't even know if I could think of who to report that to.
Yeah.
So that might be maybe that's another barrier. Who do you tell? Do you think that Mainers are, I don't know, more likely to believe in cryptids than folks in more urban cultures, and more in cities, or is there no difference there?
That's a good question. I think in Maine, we're exposed to a lot of wildlife, even close to our urban centers, like 10 minutes out of Portland, you can go out and be surrounded by trees and whatever happens to be living there for animals. So I think we get exposed to that a lot. So we know in general what's out there. The question marks you might hear are like, if somebody's like, did I run into a wolverine? Not, did I run into a mountain lion? These animals that are not common or not supposed to be here. but when you see something, you look, you want to know what you're looking at. I think maybe we have a tendency to want to be able to categorize what we're looking at because we already know, all these different animals in the state. One of the most popular posts on my blog was one about the ermines, the little weasels, the ones that are white in the winter. And so people would find them and be like, what the heck is this thing? And so being able to identify what you're seeing is I feel like we want to know. We want to know what we're looking at. We want to be able to tell people what we saw. And so cryptids, I think that, that's one of the reasons why people might not talk about it as much, because you don't know what you saw. You just know it wasn't this, or this, any of the other big mammals in Maine, the bear, the moose, the deer, the wolf, we're like, we know it was not one of those things, but what is it? So I don't know if it's so much more being willing to believe in cryptids as wanting to know what the heck that animal is,
Well, for a state of people who spend so much time outdoors, that makes sense as well. We want to have answers. What is in the outdoor environment that we're entering into? Mm-hmm. So for most of human history, I am very interested in the trajectory of the understanding of UFOs. Mm-hmm. Because, for most of human history, the belief in sightings of experiences of UFOs have sort of been maligned. They've been pushed aside. There are certainly groups that recognize them, that categorize them, that catalog them. But on the whole, it's sort of been seen as this very unbelievable phenomenon. But then in the past several years, the United States government, without taking any firm stance or making any declarations, they've definitely been investigating, and I believe I saw them calling them unidentified aerial objects now. And just the fact that the government is investigating these possibilities gives those experiences a heightened air of legitimacy. Do you anticipate that a day will come when the same happens for Bigfoot?
I think that would be terrific. I'd like to think that's what we're kind of working our way towards. I think it's already easier than it was 20 years ago for people to talk about it without people just being instantly like, right, We're certainly not all the way there yet because, A, we don't have proof yet, and B, that dismissal of things that don't fit into a category is very present still. One of the reporters that I talked to who had been sent a copy of my book by the publisher said it had been sent with a few other books about regular historical stuff. This is actually the first book on cryptozoology that my publisher has ever put out.
Wow.
So that's really exciting.
That's huge.
Groundbreaking, and that they trusted me to do that in a legitimate fashion, But he said when the books came in, he looked at them and there were the regular local histories that he might be interested in. And then he got to Bigfoot, Maine, and he was just like, yeah, right, and like put it down, but then picked it up later and started looking through it and was like, oh, this is really interesting. So it's nice to know that we're that close to being able to discuss this on a more level playing field so that at least we can have a conversation about it now and explore the existing anecdotal information and admit that, this is possible. This is a possibility of something that's out there. There's no reason why it couldn't be. So it's exciting. The prospect of that is exciting. And some of my eyewitnesses, said that back when they saw it, when they were a teenager or whatever, they thought surely, nobody was going to listen to them, first of all, because they were teenagers, but surely the adults around them would eventually encounter the same thing that they did and bring it forward and be like, here, guys, look, it exists. And now decades later, that still hasn't happened. And they're like, I thought it was like going to happen almost any day when I when I ran into this. And so I was just like, okay, it's not my job to do this. Nobody's going to listen to me anyways. I'll just let the adults take care of it. And the adults didn't take care of it. So
That never happened. Yeah. Now, of all the interviews that you did, these eyewitness interviews, is there anyone that sort of sticks out in your mind that you would be able to share a little bit with us?
oh, sure. I can actually talk to you a little bit about Mike Ledbury, who is one of those teenagers that I talked about. He lived in Brunswick growing up and had just beautiful swaths of wilderness around him, which he loved. He was out there all the time hiking and, doing a little bit of hunting, and just spent most of his free time out in the woods, learning how to move through the woods without, alerting animals that he was nearby so he could sneak up on them. And when he started having encounters, he really puzzled through it. He was like, what is this? What am I encountering? This was in the mid 70s. And, there had been a little bit of information about Patterson and Gimlin's footage from the late 60s kind of leaking through, and a little bit of pop culture. But what was more kind of in front of him was the work that Diane Fossey and Jane Goodall were doing with primates in the jungle, working to habituate them to human presence so that they could study them at close quarters, which had been unheard of up to that point. And so, he would watch the National Geographic specials. His family had a subscription. He'd read the articles about what they were doing, and, learned a few things from that he then tried to put into practice in the field.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting chain of events of him trying to develop some sort of interaction with these creatures that were very elusive. Like he was a track and field kid. He ran, and he would talk about going out there and he was always being followed by them, and he wanted to try to turn it on its head, and he wanted to try to follow them. And so every now and then he'd try to like kind of whip around and, follow them instead. And they would move so fast that he couldn't catch up with them. And he was just like, well, I guess it's not a human then, because I'm about as fast as somebody can be right now, at my age, at my fitness, at my, constant training, as an athlete. So I don't think this is some guy from down the road, who's messing with me. This is something else. So he said that was interesting. He at first would make sure he was really clean when he went out, like no scented anything. He was pretty sure that anytime he went out with a gun, there would be no sign of them. And he thinks maybe they could smell the gun oil. Mm. So all these little things that he was paying attention to and trying to work around. But then a lot of the encounters he had were surprises. He was out hiking once, and the first time he actually saw one, like really, really saw one, he had come into this little area which had a drop off. So he was up, and presumably upwind too at that point. And he looked down into this area, and next to this pine tree and this kind of waterway kind of area down there was one standing. And he looked at it and he was like, whoa, that's what I've been running into. Like I've been hearing and, just catching little flashes of in the wood. That's what I actually know what I'm encountering. And so he kept working on it from there. And it's a great story. And it's probably one of the longer ones in the book because there's a lot involved, but it's fascinating. And it's interesting because, I'd like to think that, maybe if I had been that kid, I would have probably tried to do something like that too. Cause I grew up watching National Geographic documentaries. My dad had a subscription and I was fascinated by all of that stuff. And, me and my brothers would do, smaller scale things that were, based on what we learned from hearing about scientists in the field investigating different stuff. So it's kind of fun to imagine if more kids had had that experience of living adjacent to something like that. What other stories are out there? You know, what other experiences haven't been told because they're just too beyond the pale.
Absolutely. And, kids and teens, they still have this beautiful curiosity about the world, and maybe a little bit less fear, maybe a little bit more bravery going into those woods and trying to actually see these creatures. So that makes perfect sense. I've read about, Bigfoot sightings in the United States. I've read about Bigfoot sightings in Canada. Outside of North America, are there sightings? Is this an international phenomenon?
It is, with obvious variations due to locations. So, I mean, I'm going to forget which continent. There's like the Orang Pendek. There's, you can even include the hobbit-like creatures, or hobbit-like humans, like the very small, diminutive humans that were legitimately kind of nailed down as having actually existed. They found remains. Obviously, everybody knows the Yeti from Himalaya. So it varies a lot. I think, obviously in North America, we are a massive landmass, and the US and Canada share a border, but it's an invisible border, and any wildlife will just come and go as it pleases.
Bigfoot doesn't care about the border.
So I think that's why the US has not necessarily a standardized type, but at least a very obviously related type. There's a lot of talk about in different regions, like if there's variations in the hair color because of differences in climate or undergrowth that they have to blend in with. A lot of the people I talked to in Maine either saw like a black or almost black furred creature, or one that more closely is approximated by the kind of reddish orange or the chestnut, like auburn chestnut color of orangutan fur. So that seems to be, and then some will have like a little bit of gray sprinkled through as well. And that seems to be the tendency for the Maine sightings, but that's a pretty broad range of colors for tinting of the body hair. So it's interesting.
Absolutely. I'm also curious. So it sounds like, there's a lot of sightings that were happening in a world prior to all of us having, our phones all the time. Do you imagine that the prevalence of social media, of Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, do you think that they're more likely to spread, maybe capture more sightings, and then do you think they're more likely to spread credible stories or disinformation about Bigfoot?
The hoaxers have definitely had a field day utilizing social media. There are tons and tons of videos that are pretty clearly hoaxes that continue to be circulated by people because, most people do not check their sources. There are a lot of people who are just, I'll share this, I'll forward this, and it just, so even if to the general community at large, everybody in that community knows that it's a hoax, it will still continue to be spread by people who don't realize that. So there's certainly a lot of viral misinformation that goes on. The challenge in getting good footage or a good photo still remains the fact that most of these creatures are sticking to cover. They're not, you might occasionally catch one out in the open, but it usually happens so quickly that the people involved, it never even occurs to them to grab their camera until after, so unless they've got like a dash cam on their car that's running all the time, you're just not going to get really good footage. And I don't know how much time you've spent out hiking in the woods or
Quite a bit. Yeah.
bushcrafting. Yeah. Like, you know how much camouflage is provided simply by a little margin of trees and undergrowth. It's amazing how that breaks up the outlines of everything, how it makes it really difficult to see things. And the human eye plays tricks on it too. I was out hiking with one of my friends, and there was something up in a tree that we were both convinced was a bird because of the shape of the outline that was being silhouetted because of the way it was lit. And it wasn't until we got closer that we realized it was actually just a clump of dead leaves that had magically managed to make itself look exactly like a bird. So unfortunately, you're more likely to get either a blurred photo, which the wrong thing is being focused on, or take a picture of something you thought was something else, and you're kind of matrixing what you think it is over it. It's challenging. It's really challenging. And I think it was Michael Merchant, who's a longtime Maine Bigfoot investigator, who said that, he said to me when I asked him, what do you recommend people try to do to improve their chances of, documenting something like this? And he's like, if you can't go out into the woods and take photos of all the other wildlife that's out there, then you're going to be in tough shape when it comes to that one moment where you just need to nail it and get a picture of this thing you've been trying to see. So practice, learn how animals react to movement and sound and proximity, and practice taking photos of, whatever it is, squirrels, deer, grouse, just stay in practice, and also pay attention to all the different animals that are there, because that's your context, and that will also let you know when something that isn't what you think of as the normal wildlife population, when you run into it, you'll be like, oh wait, this is something different. So being aware of everything that's around you, the sound it makes in the undergrowth, because I don't know, there were teeny tiny wrens, birds that scuffle around underneath bushes digging up grubs and stuff, and they make the most ungodly racket. And then you go to find out what it is that's making all this racket. It's this teeny tiny bird. So, it's getting to know the context that you're trying to investigate and get interesting new information from. You need to learn the context first before you can procure new information from it. So
Right. It's really flexing those wilderness awareness skills, it sounds like.
Yeah. And it's fun too, because if you only want to see Bigfoot, you're going to be bored. Having an appreciation of everything else that's going on around you, you'll never be bored. There's always something.
Absolutely. And I know that the Maine woods are so dense that even stepping off a trail can lead to some really scary circumstances for a person. So if the growth is that thick, one can only imagine, what kind of cover that gives to whatever creatures might be in those woods.
And who are in it every day and know exactly where everything is.
Right. That's their home. That's their space. So are there any resources? Obviously, I would like to talk a little bit at the end about how folks can get your book. Are there any other must-read Bigfoot resources out there, or resources that you would recommend to folks that are interested?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend the Maine Bigfoot Foundation page on Facebook, or just their website. They're all local people who are, trying to take in reports. They're not interested in ridiculing people. They're trying to get an idea of what's going on in the state. So they're doing really good work, and they're going out and doing their own field investigations in certain areas. So that's interesting if you want to kind of stay on top of what's going on. That's a great group of people to kind of be in the ranks with. For wider, countrywide kind of stuff, there's certainly a lot of information on the BFRO site, which is the Bigfoot Research Organization site, but it's incomplete. Not everything that gets reported to them gets put up on their website. So you just have to understand when you're looking at it that that's just a portion of the activity that's being reported. So when they say X number of reports for Maine, that can vary drastically from that and all the unreported ones. So for books, since we're talking to a library crowd anyway, let's see. This was a really interesting book by Robert Michael Pyle, Where Bigfoot Walks. He's on the West Coast. He's up in the Pacific Northwest, and he spent years tromping around in the forests up there and running across really interesting trackways with footprints that are not a bear's, that have, that look just like a very large bear human footprint. And he's slowly over the years become convinced that there's something out there that is hiding really, really well. But I actually learned a lot about the West Coast deforestation stuff from this, because he's also, very interested in conservatorship of the wildlands. And he talks a lot about the tensions that are constantly being generated between the loggers, between the hikers, between the people who want to use trails for ATVs or access to camps. And a lot of that can easily be carried over to Maine too, because we have a lot of those similar concerns. I think it's a lot less tense here generally, but you'll notice when stuff comes up in elections, there's plenty of heat below the surface. So, so I would say this is a really good book. And like the first half of it is a very kind of gentle, meditative talk about the nature around him in that region. And then in the second half of the book, it gets more into, he starts talking to other Bigfoot investigators, and it's a lot more heavy on that end of things. So it's a good mix. So that's a really good one. Oh my gosh, where are all my other books? Oh, down here. This is a classic by John Green. That is really, really great. And also this by Peter Byrne. These are classics from the 70s. These guys investigated for decades and collected accounts from people and went out and tried to find stuff themselves. I think both of these in one form or another have been re-released over the years. And I actually have copies of the most recent edition of this at my shop, because like I said, I talked to him and I interviewed him about another story entirely. And then if you just kind of want to go through list after list of accounts, I mean, there are lists in here, but a lot of it's just compiling all this information about Bigfoot sightings all over the country. This is a great one, and they did update it, and it's still in print as well. So, and it's got the classic Patterson-Gimlin footage freeze frame on there. So as if you had any question about what they're going to talk about, it's in there. So those are some of the classics. And then if you want to explore more about why we're so fascinated with it, this is a really interesting book, Bigfoot Exposed. I didn't necessarily agree with everything he had to say, but he's really trying to figure out why, if this thing doesn't exist, why do we keep seeing it? Why is this constantly in our minds, and why are we seeing what we see? So it's some interesting pondering of the accumulation of decades of sightings and human responses to this creature, and why we're so fascinated by it. So
that's awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. So we talked a little bit about how you might do a volume 2 for your book. Is that the next project on your horizon?
It's one of 3
Oh, wow.
that I'm working on right now. But it's probably, there's every chance that the volume 2 is the one that will get done first. But the other book I want to do that I'm working on actively right now is a similar collection of Maine ghost stories.
Oh, cool.
I had avoided doing too much ghost stuff when I wrote Strange Maine, because I was like, well, there are some really good Maine ghost story books out there already. I don't feel like I need to do more. And ironically, talking to people and interviewing them about for the Bigfoot book, a few of them had their own ghost stories, which kind of just came up in conversation. I was like, oh, wait, I guess there is plenty more that hasn't been recorded. And so in continuing with my desire to set things down on record from oral history, I'm going to dive in and do that. And like the Bigfoot in Maine, I'll start out by doing some historic cases that I found more out about than was published previously. And then I'll do a whole bunch of actual original recountings of experiences that most of which won't have been on record before.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, that sounds amazing. That's great.
Yes, I've been looking forward to this one, but I had to finish up Bigfoot in Maine first. I can't do too much all at once.
So, I want to talk a little bit about the Green Hand. So, Michelle runs this incredible shop on Congress Street. I know that we can get your book there. Would you mind telling us, one, how folks can get your book, but also what else are they going to find at your shop?
Well, you can get the book through my website, which is greenhandbookshop.com. It's very easy to do. You can either have it shipped to you or you can prepay and pick it up at the shop. Either way, that doesn't cost anything extra to pick it up. And we're open right now. We're doing some summer hours, so we're open a little bit more. So we're open 12 to 4, Wednesday through Sunday now. We just started opening on Sundays too. So a few more days in the week where we're actually open, which is exciting. And what people will find in the shop is honestly a little bit of everything. I come from the background of working in Portland Public Library, and I'm a big fan of having a wide variety of material because when you're browsing, you never know what you're going to stumble across. My shop's very well organized because I also used to supervise the shelvers at the library, and so I'm keen on being able to find things when you want to find them and to know where they are. So the shop is well organized, but there are so many different categories of books that it's practically everything. And yeah, my particular focus is like my favorite sections are like weird fiction and weird nonfiction. So, horror and mystery and sci-fi fantasy for fiction. And then for nonfiction, of course, ghosts, cryptozoology, UFOs, some occult stuff too. Just, I like the whole premise of the shop is to appeal to inquiring minds. Curiosity is my byword.
I love that. And I highly, highly encourage everybody to visit. It's like a candy store for book lovers. So let's go ahead. We have 4 questions in our chat box already. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to our audience questions. So one that happened, or one that came in like right off the bat when we started was, can you talk about the heuristic triangle and what are some of the various types of encounters that have happened there?
Sure. The heuristic triangle is the moniker that Lauren Coleman applied to a series of 3 locations that kind of pin in an area up in Aroostook County that I talked about in the International Cryptozoology Conference talk I gave a few years ago. They just happen to be very closely connected, whether that's because of where there's the most human population, which kind of in Aroostook County, the bulk of the population runs up the Route 1 corridor that comes off of, is it 95 or 295 that goes all the way up from Bangor? So everything's kind of focused along that line so far as like little settlements and small towns. So there's E-Plantation, which isn't really a legit place anymore so far as that name goes, which I think is, if I'm remembering correctly, I'm thinking Bridgewater, but that's Massachusetts. So it's just It's past Holton when you're going north.
Okay.
Past Holton, but before you get to Presque Isle, and Mars Hill and all of that. So it's kind of set off to the side there. And then one of the other locations is in Morrow Plantation, Green Pond.
Okay.
And that is remote. You really have to have a good 4x4 vehicle to get in there when the road is passable. And the other location is down close to Island Falls on the west branch of the Mattawamkeag River. So one of those was a visual sighting, for sure. 2 people saw the same thing at the same time, right on the river. And it came out of the woods, noticed them, they noticed it, it kept going, like back into the woods. They reeled up the fishing lines and went home and didn't talk about it for a while. And that's in the mid to late 90s that happened. And in Morrow Plantation, it was a fisherman who was out enjoying his fabulous day off in Green Pond, which was his favorite place to fish. And he's out in his waders with his little float, which has all his gear on it, and just kind of, relaxing, enjoying the day. Aroostook County is gorgeous in the late spring, like late May kind of time, which both of those sightings happened during. Just like blue skies, an occasional puffy cloud. The green is just starting to come up. And the bugs aren't really out yet, which is a key factor. But, he's sitting there fishing, and over the course of the day, he keeps hearing these weird noises in the woods, like large branches being snapped, like a single branch snap, as opposed to like something pushing through the undergrowth, which produces a different sound. And he didn't realize until later that the sounds were kind of moving around him in a circle as he was fishing over the course of a few hours. And then as he started to get nervous about it, there was actually a very loud roar. And at that point, he just went. He describes it really well in the book. And I really someday would like to do an illustration of it, because it's probably one of the funnier sights you will ever see, is a fisherman in his full waders with his float, like running through boggy shore material to get back to his truck and out of there. So that was the other one. And he had also had accounts from other people who spent time in the area who had had similar things happen to them, similarly inexplicable stuff. And it's an area where there's nobody around. Like, there's nobody out there. And if they came in, they would be in a vehicle and you would hear it, because there's no other sound. It's just, there's nothing there. So that nobody else is out there besides you, except for something else that you didn't realize was there. And then the other one, which was a little earlier in the 80s, was a kid who grew up in the area, he and his cousins. And actually some of the cousins' stories will be in volume 2, because there's a whole family history of these inexplicable encounters that it wasn't until much later as adults, when they talked to each other about them finally, that they realized that they were all having these experiences and not knowing what they were encountering at that age. But the scariest part of his was he used to spend nights with his cousin out in their tent in the yard, camping out, like a slumber party during the summer. And, his cousin would fall asleep, and then he'd still be a little bit awake, and he'd hear strange noises, like the sound of rocks being hit together, which at first he thought there was a horse stabled nearby. The family had a horse, and he thought the horse was like in the barn or something near them. And then later found out that it had been in a completely different pasture. So there was no way it could have been the horse. That was something that stuck around. And then another night he was in the tent and woke up to hear something snuffling around the tent, which, could be anything. but then something, and it was a tall tent, like it was a very interesting shaped tent, which has like almost a house-like shape.
Yep.
So it has like a bigger tarp on the top that kind of comes out, and then there's walls that drop down vertical to the ground. So it makes like a house shape, a traditional house shape. And it was fairly tall, certainly taller than them, probably close to 6 feet tall. So an adult could stand up inside. And they had a bug zapper light, which hung over the tent. And so it cast like a little bit of light, not a lot, but enough to create like a kind of a nightlight effect. And shortly after he heard the snuffling noise circling their tent, he saw what looked like a hand, the shadow of a hand from the light cast from the bug light, reaching out and sort of touching the tent, almost as though it was like you would reach out to touch a surface you think might still be hot, like that kind of tentative kind of touching. And then like sort of drawing the finger, like he could see the fingers being drawn along the tent.
Oh, wow.
And he's just like sitting there frozen. He can't wake his cousin up because his cousin would make a noise, and he doesn't want anything to know that he's in the tent. Like he's just frozen, absolutely frozen. And then it eventually goes away, and he eventually, after a long time, falls back asleep. But can you imagine?
That's
like,
wild.
I mean, one of many experiences he and the people in his family had. So it's interesting. And they live, E-Plantation it's off a Maine drag, a lot of farming country around it. Like there's fields plowed around it. But there's a few houses clustered on the road right there. But other than that, it's just lots of wilderness, brooks running through it. So plenty of water supply as usual. So beautiful country, absolutely beautiful.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I have a whole new area of interest. So a rustic triangle. So let's move on to our next question, which is, I don't know if this is something we can answer. I know that you were somewhat involved with Nathaniel's film, Eyes from the Pines. And someone's asking when it comes out this summer. I don't know if that's information that we have just yet.
I think I talked to him the other day because he was in town with Alex Petikoff from Small Town Monsters, and we were all talking about this kind of stuff. And I think he's hoping that July is when they will hopefully have the DVDs. He wasn't able to say exactly, but I think that's what he's hoping, that they'll be available. I know there is an event in Congress Square Plaza in Portland where they're screening it.
Okay, awesome.
So people can look that up. It's on Facebook and a bunch of other places. And that's another free event. So even if you don't have the DVD yet, you'll be able to watch the film.
Oh, that sounds really, really cool. We'll definitely keep our eyes peeled for that. And then the same person asks, do you have any favorite Bigfoot podcasts?
Oh, yeah. There's a really great one, especially if you're new to the field and you want to kind of start from the ground up. There's a really wonderful podcast that was put together by a niece of Grover Krantz, who is a famed cryptozoologist, an actual scientist who's legitimately interested in the Bigfoot phenomena. And I'm totally forgetting the name of it right now, but if you look at Grover Krantz's niece podcast, Bigfoot, you will find it. It's extremely well done. She was starting from zero information, but was really good at finding people who knew a lot about the topic and asking really good questions to find out more. So it's a really fantastic podcast. And it was like one of those, I guess what they call now a limited edition one, where they did X number of episodes and then it was done. And that one, and it looks like somebody has said Wild Thing is the name of that podcast. Thank you, Tyler. Yeah. So that's a great place to start out. If you like kind of the campfire story feel, and you like getting a little spooked out, Sasquatch Chronicles has a huge backlog of episodes, all people relating their own experiences Often stories of people who are being intimidated by these creatures. You know, a lot of them hunters. There seems to be a lot of territoriality involved in that. So if you want to do a real deep dive, Sasquatch Chronicles is a good place to do that.
Okay.
And there's a lot of other podcasts that cover it here and there. But those are the two that I listen to, like, on a fairly regular basis.
Awesome. Well, we've got somebody wondering if there have been any sightings in the Webb and Carthage area in southern Franklin County.
Oh, that's a good question. Where's my gazetteer?
Yeah, maybe I can bring up.
This is the best book in the world.
Yeah. Oh, you can't live in Maine if you don't have a gazetteer. You gotta have one.
Your GPS can't tell you everything.
Anecdotally, I once went to a library conference not very far, just up at Sunday River, and I drove up with a colleague not from Maine, and I said, we got to bring a gazetteer. He said, but I have GPS. Well, that GPS failed on the way home.
Yeah.
The gazetteer is a necessity.
Mm-hmm. That's what happens. Okay, so Carthage. Strong, which is not that far away from Carthage, seems to. Strong and Phillips, definitely. Lots of stuff going on. Weld, which I think is where Tumbledown Mountain is. Also some interesting accounts from that area. There's a lot of townships out here. Oh yeah. So that's near Richardson Lake. Yeah, that is absolutely, there's all sorts of interesting stuff up there. Moosup-Meguntic, yeah. So that area has a long history of really interesting things going on. So, and Mexico, there's at least one Mexico account that's going to be in volume 2. So
cool.
Yeah. So yes.
So it's a hotbed of activity, actually.
And, you know, part of it probably has to do with, you know, the amount of really substantial bodies of water in that area. Like there's some great water systems all scattered through there, but there's also lots and lots of tree cover. Like there's plenty of public reserve lands up there, which maintain like a swath of wilderness for anything to move through without being interrupted. So
right, yeah, that makes perfect sense. This is kind of a different question. Someone wants to know, did you come across any dogman stories while researching this book, or any Bigfoot UFO links, as are common in some areas like Pennsylvania?
There are definitely cases in Maine for both of those arms of the cryptozoological and weird type of investigations. I haven't personally talked to anybody who had a dogman sighting, but I know that, is it Palmyra? There's a big one in Maine that was reenacted on Paranormal Witness.
Oh, wow.
Slightly over dramatized, but the case itself is really interesting. And Linda Godfrey talks about it in one of her books too. So that one was really interesting. And there have been other ones too, although I think most people, it's even tougher to explain to people you've run into a dogman than it is to explain you ran into Bigfoot. So any reports I've heard of that are current generally tend to be anonymous, because, you know, they're everyday people with professional lives who don't want everybody at their workplace going, that's the person that saw a dogman, you know. So there are definitely some accounts in Maine. Just keep your ears perked up and you will run across some of them eventually. And then the UFO stuff, Maine has plenty of UFO traffic over the decades. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Nomar Slevik, who has written a few really good books about Maine and New Hampshire UFOs, covered one, which I think maybe at Loring Air Force Base.
You're right.
Air Force bases,
yeah.
in the 60s, where they were having UFO activity. One of the men on duty who I think was out with with a guard dog, actually encountered hairy bipedal form as well. So I know that is out there and has been, legitimately like put down on record as to what was being encountered. So, and I think probably at least one of my eyewitnesses has a whole bunch of UFO related encounters that he's run into. And I don't know how much he equates that with his Bigfoot experience, because his experience was when he was a kid, when he was really, really young. And I don't know how closely it ties to his adult experiences. We haven't talked a whole lot about that. And I know Michael Merchant, who, as I mentioned before, he's a longtime Maine Bigfoot investigator. I don't know if he theorizes that they're directly related, but like a lot of other people, he's like, there's a lot of weird stuff happening in the same spaces. So it may have more to do with, I don't know, what some people call a window area, where just in general, weird is going on. So.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. So we've got a very interesting question here. So in your book, the older stories from the 1970s seem to be more dramatic type A encounters, whereas the newer ones seem to be more brief sightings. Do you have a sense of why this is? And in your second book, the person says they would love to have you do another interview with Susie, as it seems she could provide a lot more details of her longstanding encounters. The person writes, I kept wanting that chapter to go on longer. She had such a rich encounter.
Yeah, Susie's case is very interesting. There's a really good documentary. If the person that asked the question, if they haven't looked it up already from the link I provided in the book, I definitely recommend that you do, because it's a very well produced little documentary, and she goes into great detail about a whole bunch of stuff in that. One of the reasons that I left stuff out of Susie's chapter is because she's very protective of the location and some of the details. She's very sensitive to the fact that some information could be used to hunt the Bigfoot family that she was acquainted with, and she doesn't want that to happen. So I left a few things out because of that. And also because I feel like her story probably is a book unto itself. And, if somebody, I know she's talked to at least one person about writing that book with her. I don't want to steal her thunder at all. So with any luck, we will hear more from Susie one way or another in the future, but definitely check the documentary on the Lincoln County Television public access website out, because it's really fascinating. And, you hear her speak and you can see her face and her reactions, and, she's a very genuine person. And it's, some of it's heartbreaking, but it's all very real. So that's Susie. So far as the 70s experiences being different, there were some that were chance encounters, the Durham gorilla being a prime example of that, and also the one that took place in the White Mountains area, where people are just crossed paths with something. But I think maybe the answer to that might partly be because, and especially because these are usually kids, when they were having these long-term encounters. And so they had a lot of freedom to roam where they were. Nobody was worried about anything happening to them if they were let run wild in the woods. That wasn't an issue back then. And I think child rearing is very different now. Like, I think it's difficult for kids to find that kind of freedom without their parents like freaking out. So that might be part of it. I mean, we might find out 10 or 20 years down the road, there's a whole other generation of kids that had encounters like these and didn't talk about them for similar reasons. Only time will tell. And so most of the later accounts are adults who are out doing their everyday adult things. And as an adult, I know I'm always in a hurry.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
I was on the go all day long today, all week long. Like I could, like I was a few minutes late because I was trying to like stuff some pizza in my mouth because I hadn't had lunch earlier because I was too busy at work at the shop. So it's like, and I feel like our whole lives are like that. We're always going from one place to the other, doing all these things. We rarely put ourselves in situations where we're just in a place out in the woods regularly for long stretches of time, to the point where we can sit there and pay attention to everything that's going on around us, listening to the sounds, hearing them shift, watching different birds and creatures go by us. Like, who does that? Like, you don't get to do stuff like that until you retire, I think. and at that point, you're probably like, I don't want to sit in one place too long anymore because my spine hurts. Or, I think that is probably a really legit explanation for the difference in the encounters. And again, it'll be really interesting to see if 10 or 20 years from now we start hearing other encounters from people who did have that freedom as kids and encountered some really interesting stuff that they just you know childhood oftentimes seems like a dream.
Yeah.
And it's not until you like talk to your friends or family when you're much older and you realize they might have had similar things in their experience that you're not alone, and that maybe you didn't imagine at all. It's an interesting time in life.
Absolutely. Well, we've got one final question for the night, and it's, have there been any Washington County sightings?
Yeah, let's see. I have my Gazette book. My cat is now sitting on top of my.
Oh, well.
Very carefully. Thank you.
It's a grand crime to remove the cat's spot, so.
Yeah, it's hazardous to say the least. Okay, so 6. Let's see what's up there. I could look at lists and stuff, but this is way more fun. So.
Oh yeah.
I'm sure there have been. So, a lot of townships up here. Grand Falls. I feel like I've heard Greenfield in people's descriptions here and there. West Grand Lake. Oh, Sisladobsis Lake is up there, and that is actually that's got its own lake monster legends associated with it.
Okay, that's very cool.
So even if you don't get as many Bigfoot, yeah, okay. One of the cases in the book is from Baileyville, which butts right up against New Brunswick there. So that's, yeah, so there are, and also there's the Passamaquoddy Reservation up there, and they kind of keep their own council. So I can't speak for them. They might not even want people to speak for them. So I'm not going to say anything on that account, but it's part of Maine, so you can guess where my theories are going to go with that. But there is going to be activity up there. It's so close to everything else. Yeah, and the Washington County stuff comes right down towards like Steuben. I have friends that live there, and that's really close to the Ellsworth and verging into the Mid-Coast area. And there's a whole slew of those in the book. So it's definitely part of the flow of traffic through the state, because a lot of talking to people who pay a lot of attention to that and get out in the field and do things, the general theory is that they don't necessarily migrate with the seasons, but they have kind of a loop that they work through. So depending on what seasonally available foods are available, they'll work their way through a region in a certain fashion so that they don't exhaust food supplies and strip the land so that it keeps producing more. So So anywhere you're going to wind up with sightings, it's probably part of a kind of a circuit that's being used as a larger territory. So a lot of these areas, like you might have an individual sighting in one location, but it's only part of a much larger kind of traffic pattern, for lack of a better word. That's pretty, a lot of the people I've talked to, that's the general theory. So kind of like a black bear, basically, who, you know, has a large, like 30 to 40 square mile loop that they work through. It's the same kind of thing.
Very similar. Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, you know, wildlife behaving like other wildlife. Absolutely. Well, we've exhausted my questions. We've exhausted the audience's questions. I mean, I'm sure we could all come up with more, but we'd be here all gosh darn night. So I just want to thank everybody for being here. And I want to thank Michelle. You know, it's always a delight speaking with you. I'm so much looking forward to future volumes of this book and other projects that you're working on. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us tonight. And if anybody has any lingering questions, if you want to email reference@falmouthmemoriallibrary.org, I can facilitate getting you in touch with Michelle, and make sure to go out and visit her shop and get that book, and you can read expanded versions of all the things they've talked about tonight. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time when Michelle's next book comes out.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.